Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Randy Bach. Today is December 16, 2022, and I'm honored, genuinely honored, to have Dr. Aaron Kheriaty with me today. He is one of the bravest men out there. It may not show right here. He doesn't have his armor and his spear and so forth with him, as any good warrior should, but he has been fighting the war essentially for ideas, and for not just ideas, not just his ideas, but for having the open ability to have dialogue, both in medicine, in society, and in science, which is often misinterpreted as dogma, but it's not. So he has suffered the slings and arrows of outrageous misfortune, but I don't like to call it that, because I think he's resilient enough to have found the opposite, the silver lining in certain clouds. So I'm going to let him describe what those are. I think they're going to be a little bit surprising to you to find out where we stand these days in terms of open debate. Maybe it's not surprising. Maybe it shouldn't be surprising. I think, anyway, so Dr. Kheriaty, please tell us a little bit about yourself, what's been new and different with you in the last year or two.
Yeah. So thanks, Randy. It's great to be here having this conversation with you. And I guess I could start my own story just about a year ago, where at that time, this time last year, I had spent 15 years, really the entirety of my career, as an academic physician at the University of California, Irvine. So my specialty in medicine is psychiatry. I spent about half my time in the Department of Psychiatry as a professor in the School of Medicine, teaching, doing clinical work, seeing patients, supervising residents on psychiatric-related work. The other half of my time was spent doing medical ethics. So I was the director of the medical ethics program at UC Irvine. I chaired the ethics committee at the hospital. I chaired the ethics committee also at the Department of State Psychiatric Hospitals in California. And I was humming along in my academic career, pursuing both of those loves, medicine and specifically mental health and psychiatry on the one hand, and medical ethics on the other hand. And I was involved, when COVID came, I was involved in developing policies rather, that had ethics implications for the entire university. So I worked on the pandemic triage policy in terms of, if we run out of a scarce resource like ventilators, how do we prioritize, and who gets that scarce resource? So difficult policy with obviously some difficult ethical questions. And I was working with the UC Office of the President on these policies. So these were policies that applied not just to UC Irvine, my own branch campus, but to UCLA, UCSF, really all 5 of the campuses that had a hospital. Up until the university announced that it was going to mandate the COVID vaccine. And when the vaccine mandate was announced, that was not a policy that had gone through our committee or that we were really consulted on. And I found that puzzling, because it was clear to me that vaccine mandates would be in 2021 certainly the most controversial, and also I think the most ethically fraught of the different types of issues that we were dealing with during COVID, and the different policies that institutions were adopting. So last August, I published a piece in the Wall Street Journal because I was concerned about this policy that the university was contemplating. And the title was "University Vaccine Mandates Violate Medical Ethics." And I argued there, along with my co-author, who's a professor of law at Notre Dame, that these policies were problematic because they violated the principle of informed consent, a principle that's really a bulwark of 20th century medical ethics, first articulated in the Nuremberg Code following World War II, and then instantiated in various federal laws to protect, first of all, to protect people who are involved in medical experiments, saying that you can't do a medical experiment or enroll someone in a medical experiment without their consent, without them understanding the risks and benefits and then agreeing.
Well, plus, it's not consent. If you have a 5-year-old child and you tell him you're going to go X, Y, and Z, it's not a consent. That it's okay for a child, but
that's right.
So
that's right.
The informed consent part is whether the information part is accurate, being presented accurately, contextually, whether it's being changed as far as the information part, and whether you are actually given the opportunity to give consent.
Precisely. Yes, just so. So informed consent in the case of a child would apply to the informed consent given by parents or guardians on behalf of that child who's too young to consent because the child's too young to understand what's being asked of him or her. And this is a principle that not only functions in biomedical research, but also functions in the clinical setting. As you know, when we do something as a physician, when we propose a treatment or an intervention to a patient or for a patient, we cannot do that except under very narrowly defined emergency conditions. We can't do that without getting the patient's consent. Or if the patient's in a coma and the patient can't consent, we at least have to get the consent of the next of kin. And the patient or their surrogate decision maker needs to be given information, as you said, accurate information on the risks, benefits, and alternatives to the treatment, and be given the opportunity to accept or decline that proposed intervention. And this is precisely what vaccine mandates were not doing. There was the threat of, if you don't comply with this mandate and get the injection of a novel vaccine that you may or may not have wanted, you could be at risk of losing your job or losing your scholarship if you're a student, or not being able to attend the university where you've spent maybe the last few years and are almost ready to graduate from. So this is obviously a very severe penalty to hold over the heads of individuals. And under those circumstances, whatever consent the person gives is not truly informed consent because it's done under some form of coercion or distress. So setting aside, at that time, even setting aside the controversies on was this product adequately tested? Are there concerns about safety or efficacy? From the beginning, I had an issue with the vaccine mandates that was grounded purely in medical ethics, purely in these kinds of ethics concerns about informed consent. The argument that was being put forward at that time as to why vaccine mandates were justified is, well, maybe it won't help the individual who's getting the vaccine. Maybe they're young, healthy, and otherwise at low risk from COVID, but they have a duty to society. They have a duty to other people to get this sort of social solidarity argument because it's going to help other people. That argument might have held some sway if we had what was called a sterilizing vaccine, a vaccine capable not only of lowering my risk of getting sick or dying, but also preventing me from getting infected and transmitting the virus to other people. And we knew, at least people who were paying attention to the clinical trials data and the early data on the vaccines, knew that these vaccines could not do that. The vaccines did not stop infection or transmission. So in my view, that social solidarity argument sort of fell apart. It didn't apply in the case of these particular products.
May I interject one question point? Yeah. I think, the example I've heard is that George Washington troops were not asked whether they would take a smallpox inoculum. They had, they used pustules and so forth from smallpox or blisters, whatever you want to call it. And I the argument, like if you are in war, you can be conscripted and sent off to battle and die. There's no real question about that. But I think there is kind of the exception that at some point your informed consent, one way or another, whether it's informed or whether it's consent, is irrelevant if in fact space aliens drop down, Terminator style, whatever, or maybe I have the wrong movie. But if there's a big enough emergency, I think there's a potential solidarity war like cohesion and coalescence. But that's not. I think that some of those arguments where we have to do this, we're all in this together. But I think it was a little bit of bait and switch in terms of severity, and I think that was a little bit clouded from the populace.
Yeah, I think that's precisely right. And you mentioned soldiers, and the smallpox vaccine. Actually, at the time when I published that article, and we mentioned this in the article, soldiers in the U.S. military had more rights to decline the vaccine than people at the university under a vaccine mandate. And the reason was, at that time at least, all of the available products were authorized only under emergency use. And there was a precedent-setting case that said even soldiers in the Army who relinquished some rights when it comes to informed consent by being conscripted in the Army still retain the right to decline participation in a medical experiment. And under our own federal government's definition all the emergency use products were still experimental. And so the military was not able to mandate the vaccine until later, when the Pfizer Kheriaty product was given provisional full authorization. And so funny enough, that soldiers who usually have fewer rights in this regard actually had more rights than students at the University of California, where I was at when the
And
university
mind you, a
first.
lot of them will have to take certain vaccines. I mean,
Mhm.
I'm not sure if it's an anthrax vaccine or like an immunoglobulin or whatever, but for certain battle theaters, which is a funny use of the term theater, they will not be asked. They'll be given, I don't know, say yellow fever vaccine or whatever for going to Southeast Asia. And so there are certain times where they'll take vaccines and or, special antidote type arrangements for certain situations because they're going to be in battle. But I think those are for life-threatening situations, and when those people are genuinely at risk themselves.
Yeah, that's right. That was another issue with these vaccine mandates, is that we failed to take into account the very significant age gradient with COVID. So the two most basic epidemiological facts about COVID: number one, the infection fatality rate, which is 0.2%. That's been replicated many times over. And we knew that by April of 2020 after the Santa Clara study. And so the initial terrifying numbers of 3 to 4% of people who get infected are going to die, that the World Health Organization initially announced, turned out to be off by orders of magnitude.
So how many were you said? Well, I think the ultimate number wasn't like it was 0.04% or something like that.
Well, it depends on the age. Overall, it was 0.2%, I think, is the overall infection fatality rate.
Right.
But the vast majority of those, and this is the second most important epidemiological fact about COVID, the vast majority of those are in individuals over the age of 70. Right. So if you look at under the age of 50, your risk of dying from COVID is similar to your risk of dying.
I agree with you. They were literally, if you went from like a healthy 7-year-old to an unhealthy 77-year-old, there were literally 10,000 to 100,000 times
that's right.
in risk.
Precisely. Yeah, that's right. So many of the people who got the vaccine were not at significant risk from COVID, and the risks of the vaccine, at least early on, were unknown. And now there's some risks of the vaccine that are more well characterized. Mm-hmm. But in any case, there were problems with informed consent, because I think the knowns and the unknowns were not fully disclosed to many patients who received the vaccine. That was a problem. And I also started to see people at the university having appropriate exemptions declined kind of arbitrarily, whether religious exemptions or medical exemptions. And so I ended up getting to the point where I said to myself, okay, publishing an article in a newspaper to try to get a conversation going was important and maybe helpful. But in my position as director of medical ethics, if I see something being rolled out that I really do think is harmful, I felt that I was in a position where I needed to try to do something to actually stop that from moving forward. So I challenged this vaccine mandate in federal court. I filed a suit in federal court challenging it under the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause of our Constitution, on behalf of people like me who had already recovered from COVID and had natural infection-induced immunity.
I know. I'm gonna take a quick break there and just bring to our audience attention that I think it was 2004, 2006, that Dr. Fauci himself said there was no point in ever getting a vaccine if you've had the actual illness. I think he was talking which swine flu or H1N1, one of those flu type things he was talking about. He said, it's like, if you've had the illness, there is no point in getting the vaccine. The illness is complete coverage, and a vaccine is only one tiny protein. So anyway, his own words. And if you go fact check this thing, go check the fact checkers, they're like, well, mostly this, mostly that. They can't come out and say, I'm a big vaccine guy. I love vaccines, and I took flu shots every year, but always before the episode.
Before you got influenza, yeah, right.
And not afterwards. And there's a lot of, there's this ADE, antibody dependent enhancement potentially from taking something after the fact. You've already had the immune system aggravated, and then you're re-challenging it with a
that's right.
An antigen that is, from which you've already, seen. So you're going to have a reaction to it. So anyway, I apologize for that little break.
No, I mean, that's the very important point, precisely the point I was trying to make in my lawsuit. And we know that what vaccines try to do is to get as close as they can to mimicking the immunity conferred by infection, but without making you sick. That's the whole concept behind how, vaccine. What is a vaccine? How does it work? But we don't have cases of vaccines for viruses in the past or in the present where the vaccine immunity was superior to post-infectious natural immunity. Mm-hmm. So, it should have been clear from the beginning, just on a theoretical level, that this was the case. Now it's very clear based on research that the immunity conferred by prior infection is not perfect, but it's considerably better than vaccine immunity. It lasts longer. Yeah, it has more breadth against new variants.
It's pretty obvious stuff, and the vaunted Dr. Fauci himself said so. I mean, yeah. So we have that to work on.
Yeah. So so what happened? Very sweet. If you want to go sideways with your employer, one good way to do that is to sue them in federal court. So they acted very quickly. They declined my medical exemption twice, and then they placed me on investigatory leave, followed by a month later by unpaid suspension, followed a month after that. They fired me. So, they moved to get rid of me basically as quickly as so. Because last December, I lost my job at the university over this issue.
Okay, so let me ask you a few questions around that. At which point did you know that was going to happen? I mean, did you kind of read the tea leaves, knowing that one, if you give a mouse a cookie, he's going to want a glass of milk. Give him a glass of milk, he's going to want a place to nap. Did you kind of see the sequence of things that would happen in this escalation, or were you hoping that the voice of reason would allow you some protection or tenure or whatever?
Well, I was, because for my part, I was willing to be quite flexible and willing to allow the university, at least while the case was being heard and while we were waiting for the judge to make a ruling, allow the university to save face by finding a way to accommodate me. So, for example, there were some faculty members who declined.
Lost Dr. Kheriaty. There we go.
Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened. I usually have a pretty good internet connection.
It could have been Gavin Newsom.
Yeah. He got wind of. So let me just back up a little bit. You can cut that. So I was willing to be flexible and to work with the university so that they wouldn't have to abandon their policy prior to the judge making a ruling, but also so that they could allow me to continue as a faculty member. And they accommodated other faculty members by allowing them to work from home, for example. And about 2/3 of my work at that time was by telemedicine or remote, could have been done from home. So I was willing to go part-time and work from home. I was willing to even take an unpaid sabbatical for a year or two until the pandemic is over. But they were in no mood to sort of work with me at that point, and moved as swiftly as they could to fire me.
Right. So the question remains, so you were hoping there'd be some accommodation, but were you prepared, what is it? Plan for the best, hope for the best, plan for the worst?
Yeah, I certainly knew when I filed the lawsuit that was most likely going to be the beginning of the end for me at UCI, and that it would be probably hard for me to continue there, regardless of what happened with the lawsuit. So I had a sense, certainly, that things were going to play out that way. And certainly after they placed me on unpaid suspension, they did say, well, okay, if you get the jab, while you're on leave, then you can come back, right? Mm-hmm. So if I get the jab, then I no longer have standing. The lawsuit in court disappears. They're happy because I haven't challenged them, and they were willing to take me back. At least that's what they said. So certainly by that point, I realized that no, if I continue to pursue down this line, and if I continue to refuse vaccination at the university, they're not going to accommodate me. They're going to fire me.
Okay, so side question, if I may. So was the lawsuit for Dr. Aaron Kheriaty, or was it for University of California students in general, employees and so forth? Both. That's A. And B, part B is, where has the lawsuit gone?
Yeah. So the lawsuit would have directly impacted everyone at the University of California. If my argument had prevailed in court, then the university would be forced to change their policy to at least accommodate natural immunity. And so it was me and people similarly situated. So I didn't file the lawsuit just for me. I filed it because I thought this policy needs to be changed. I'm seeing good nurses getting fired. I'm seeing students getting forced out.
Right. The so-called frontline workers for whom everyone a significant debt a little bit cast aside the following year.
Precisely. And also it would have set a precedent in federal court that this issue had to be considered in terms of other vaccine mandates. So it potentially would have changed many of the institutional vaccine mandates around the country, because if my argument is correct, then there was a constitutional right that was being violated by a policy like this. And if that's the case, presumably other policies that are doing the same thing are also violating constitutional rights of citizens. So the case was pretty high stakes. And what ended up happening in the case, unfortunately, is that the ruling went in the direction of the university. And the reason it did had to do with the level of scrutiny that the court applied to the policy. So just a little bit of a legal sidebar. If the court had agreed that there was a constitutional right at stake to refuse a vaccine, then they would have had to apply either an intermediate or a strict level of judicial scrutiny to the policy. And that would have meant we could actually get into the fact-finding and evidential arguments about natural immunity. Had we done that, the science was clearly on my side. The CDC came around, earlier this year to say we shouldn't distinguish between vaccinated and unvaccinated because natural immunity is robust and because the vaccines don't prevent infection and transmission. It was precisely my argument in the case a year ago. But my case wasn't allowed to actually get into the science. And the reason is, what they said is all this policy has to do is pass what's called a rational basis review, which means the university had a public health reason to initiate the policy, and that's all they had to demonstrate. Meaning they didn't have to show that the policy actually achieved its intended purpose. They didn't have to show that the benefits outweighed the harms. They didn't have to show it was narrowly tailored. We didn't have to get into any of that.
What if they had decided that Asian students, or back in, speaking of Nuremberg and so forth, that Jewish students presented a health problem? I mean, Germany actually did this. They characterized a lot of their initial laws under health standards. I'm not sure if that's well known, but the Jews were metaphorically labeled vermin and so forth, and then a lot of it was kind of cross-categorized. So question, I mean, maybe I'm not sure you can answer this question, but is it any statute that the university comes up with, if they're working on presumed good faith, that's a standard belief, they're allowed to get away with that?
So judicial precedent would not allow them to get away from that, because judicial precedent would have said, under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, you cannot discriminate based on race. And also there's this thing in federal law called Title IX that prohibits race-based discrimination. So a policy like that would have been struck down either under Title IX or under the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. I was trying to make an analogous case, but what the court said, unfortunately, is we have this precedent from 1905, a case called Jacobson v. Massachusetts, where the Supreme Court upheld the city of Boston's mandate for actually a smallpox vaccine. But what I've argued, and I wrote about this on my Substack newsletter, is that if you look at the 1905 Jacobson case, number one, the penalty that was applied in that case was very modest. It was a $5 fine, which adjusted for inflation would be about $160 today. So I would have happily paid a $160 fine if that allowed me to decline the COVID vaccine when I didn't need it. Right? That's obviously a less severe penalty than losing my job and losing my academic career. So I think that's one issue with the Jacobson precedent. It's actually a very modest precedent. The other issue with the Jacobson precedent is that it's been misapplied before. And the most notorious case where it was misapplied is a 1927 eugenics case, actually, speaking of your example of, racial discrimination. Back in the 1920s, about half the states in the US had laws permitting the state to involuntarily sterilize individuals that were mentally incapacitated or disabled in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And a young woman named Kheriaty Buck challenged this law. She was diagnosed with congenital feeble-mindedness, which was a very loose category back then, just as it would be today.
I think I actually have that myself.
Right, I'm suffering from it, at least as I age.
Well, it's sort of late in the day. I get that.
So the case went to the Supreme Court, and to our shame, the Supreme Court upheld the state of Virginia's law permitting the involuntary sterilization of Kheriaty Buck, and it cited Jacobson. It said that the principle that allowed for forced vaccination is, quote, wide enough to cover the cutting of the fallopian tubes. And then the infamous line written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., famous American jurist,
Mm-hmm.
in the majority opinion said three generations of imbeciles are enough, period. So that's a case that's obviously, on the wall of shame, like Dred
Mm-hmm.
Scott and other things that, we are certainly not proud of. So what I was arguing is, look, the court has never articulated a meaningful limit to that Jacobson precedent. And clearly that precedent can be and has been in the past misapplied. So surely that precedent can't mean just any sort of a vaccine mandate, no matter how harmful or egregious,
right,
would pass judicial muster. Now, the court didn't buy that argument and cited the Jacobson precedent and basically said, the state, or in this case, even private institutions, have a right to mandate vaccines for employers. And I think that's a problematic case precedent that should require more judicial scrutiny and should allow us to look at the scientific evidence and talk about things like potential benefits and potential harms.
All right, so I'm going to segue to the next phase of Dr. Kheriaty's life and adventure, and I also want to reserve some time. I'm hoping that we can stay on for 45 minutes or an hour. It's up to you. If you have
I'm good. I have to go to the bank at 4 p.m., so I'm good for about 45 minutes from here.
So I'd like to leave time for, at any rate. So the question would be, what happened? What have you done? How did you take it? How did your own mental equilibrium work out? Where are you now, and what's the fight?
So initially, back in December, I was casting about just how to put food on the table for my wife and 5 kids, and where was I going to get health insurance in January. So I quickly connected with an old colleague, actually my former residency training director, who's leaving the university around the same time, and we set up a private practice so I could at least see my patients. And then I started working with some independent think tanks, some research institutes that gave me some support. So the Ethics and Public Policy Center in DC and the Brownstone Institute and another institute here in California kind of came to my rescue to allow me to continue doing some of my research and my writing and my public speaking on public health and public policy related issues. So it was disorienting at first, but I'm grateful that I have landed on my feet in 2022 and been able to continue supporting my family and sort of make a career in medicine and in my work in bioethics outside of the university. I do miss the teaching of students, the supervision of residents. That's kind of the one thing that I haven't really been able to replicate this year, outside of the university. But the other work I was doing, I've been able to continue, and in some cases even expand.
So that's good. I have seen a lot of your work. I was fortunate to have a piece in Brownstone recently myself, and I know some other writers of Brownstone, and it's a high bar. Mr. Tucker is an excellent editor.
He is,
and it looks for quality. So that's a feather in your cap. Well, I'm happy that you've landed somewhat on your feet. Where do things stand in California? I know you write, and I will refer people to your Substack, and you've written on the California law, which I find like horrifyingly eye-opening.
Yeah.
We want to discuss that. I don't know, remember the number of the law, but what's going on with that, and where do things stand?
Yeah, thanks for asking about that, because you sort of were asking previously, where does the fight stand now? And so I'll talk about two other lawsuits that I'm involved with. I'll start with the California one. And this is a lawsuit challenging a law that was recently passed in California called Assembly Bill 2098, AB 2098, which I went up to Sacramento and testified against when it was being heard in the Senate Health Committee. The committee didn't take my advice and passed the law anyway, and went to the floor. The legislature passed it, and the governor signed it. So it's set to go into effect in January. But along with 5 other physicians in California, we filed a lawsuit challenging this law on constitutional grounds in federal court, arguing that it violates doctors' First Amendment free speech rights and also violates our equal protection under the 14th Amendment.
I think it also, I wonder if, it would seem to violate patients' rights as well.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, maybe just briefly, let me explain what the law says and what it does. It basically says that the Medical Board of California is empowered to discipline any physician who, in the course of advising patients, gives advice that contradicts the government's preferred, public health measures or public health narrative, specifically on COVID.
Where could that possibly go wrong?
Yeah, no, exactly. So it's a kind of gag order on physicians. And what I tell people is, look, I don't care where you are politically or ideologically, left, right, liberal, conservative. I don't know of any person in California that wants to go to their physician and ask their physician a question about COVID and have the physician read from a script written by the California Department of Public Health. They want their physician's actual opinion on whatever it might be: masks, the vaccines, other COVID treatments, other interventions. And, how could they possibly trust their physician if their physician is not actually able to give an honest answer and say what they think, because they're literally afraid of losing their medical license? Now, the patient might decline your recommendation or might be wary of your opinion. Oh, fine, no problem. They can go seek a second opinion. They can go on the website and see what the state of California has to say about this intervention. But I don't know of anyone who would want their doctor to feel like they couldn't be honest with their patients. So this is, while we're arguing that this is a violation of the free speech rights of physicians, which is true, and it's a good legal argument, it's problematic not primarily because physicians won't be able to say what they're thinking in this regard, but it's problematic because it's going to harm the doctor-patient relationship, and patients won't be able to get accurate answers to their.
Yeah, and I actually, I think in the short and long run, patients will suffer because they're not given the optionality.
Yeah,
of
precisely.
treatments that fall outside of what the government wants. I mean, the government is not a neutral party for health decisions. More and more, there are government, insurers. There's always for a long time, for the last 80 years or so, there's been Medicaid, and so Medicaid is like 60 years old, and Medicare, goes back a little bit further, but there is a government interest in paying for certain types of medicine, and God forbid, almost literally God forbid, they might have a stake in deciding, whether doctors can talk about, PSA before age 50, because they don't necessarily want to pay out, and not just that, but they might have other interests that certain people might not be worthy for one reason or another, based on their politics or their hairstyle or whatever, to receive types of treatments. And it could be a government law, and it seems to me that that's pretty much precisely what our friends over in 1930s Germany were perpetrating, unless I'm wrong.
No, you're exactly right. So what happened in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s, even prior to the Nazis coming to power, is that German medicine went sideways. And they did so because there was a shift in German medical ethics from a traditional Hippocratic ethic that said, my primary responsibility, my fiduciary duty, is to the individual sick patient in front of me. And then so the traditional Hippocratic norms of I need to do what I can to help and heal this particular patient, and I need to do what I can to minimize harm to this patient. And I can't use this patient instrumentally for some other purpose, even if it's a good one, right? What happened in Germany was this metaphor took over starting in the 1920s, that German medicine and German physicians' primary responsibility was to the social organism, to the health of society as a whole, to the Volk, right? The German people who could be healthy or sick. And on that metaphor, if you have part of the body politic that is a quote unquote cancer, because, you know, this individual is disabled or a drain on the economic resources or what does a physician do with a cancer? He carves it out and gets rid of it to improve the health of the whole. Well, so what happened was the duty to the patient shifted to a duty to society. And then when a corrupt regime took over with a corrupt social program, medicine became totally corrupted because its allegiance was to the state program.
I know this. I mean, I remember reading this, but it's somewhat ironic because, you know, people kind of think Germany, oh, they started a bunch of wars, you know, so forth. But Germany was the center of intellect and
That's right.
Kind of like the post-Renaissance renaissance of science. And they're, I guess, sort of, I mean, I think they're the inventors of what we have as the medical tradition right now. Medical schools kind of graded and discussed procedures, advancing along the way.
The research university system in the United States is modeled off the German research university of the late 19th, early 20th century.
Yeah, and specifically in medicine, they were the strongest.
That's right.
And it's just kind of like you can see how things, like you call it sideways, which is generous because I think it's going to hell.
Off a cliff. Yeah, that's probably a better metaphor.
I mean, I'd be happy, like in those cartoons, you know, that they run off the cliff, they go sideways. I mean, that's kind of cool when they look down and they realize there's no support. So
nothing under my feet.
The only thing worse than going sideways is not when that stops. So I think you're generous in that regard. So, you know, you bring up, for me anyway, because I was looking at some of your other writings. They were readings to me when I was reading them about where medical schools are going and the Hippocratic Oath. This guy Hippocrates, he was Greek and he was a while ago, so you know we don't pay attention to old people. And he was a white guy, I imagine.
Very passé. Right.
So when I went to medical school, there was a professor of pharmacology, Louis Lasagna, and a memorable name, but he's a great guy, and rest his soul. And he made an amendment to the Hippocratic Oath, which kind of pervaded medical schools a little bit. And now there's yet another oath that is, I don't know. And I think it's verging on what you're saying. I assume you're familiar with it. I don't. You know, this is maybe another day, another topic. If I could ever get you back on, I would love that. But you know, we're going to be running towards our end zone here in the next 7 or 8 minutes. But what are your perceptions or apperceptions about what's going on medically in education?
So unfortunately,
those oaths we take.
Yeah. So let's start with the oaths, because this is a trend that's actually been going on for decades where, you know, some medical schools, their oath was literally written by like the med school class of 1972 or something like this. And others, they tweak them every year and they sort of make them up as they go along. And, you know, you may think the Oath of Hippocrates is anachronistic, but it's got a lot going for it. First of all, longevity. It guided medicine for the better part of 2,000 years. And second of all, it's very concrete, so that you can know when you're fulfilling the oath, and you can know that, you know, when you're not fulfilling the oath. And the oath has some things that you can't do, right? Like it talks about sexual relationships with a patient or with the patient's members of the patient's household. You can't do that. It has to do with the power dynamics and the need, you know, for patients to be able to trust the physician in terms of the physical exam. You know, you have to disrobe, you have to allow the doctor into intimate aspects of your life when you give a history. And so given that power dynamic, if a doctor uses that to seduce a patient, it's going to be problematic and harmful. The oath says doctors shouldn't kill their patients. It's very, very clear prohibition against euthanasia. Whereas the modern oaths are kind of vague and aspirational, and they're sort of I will always, in every way, serve my patient and serve society. Well, how do you know if you're fulfilling that, and how do you know if you're violating that?
Right.
You don't. And so the oath ends up being kind of an empty cipher. It sounds grandiose and nice when you stand up at the white coat ceremony or at graduation and recite this thing. But some of the turns that we've seen in the oath are precise. I think maybe you were getting at this with the spaghetti or lasagna or whatever the guy's name is, right? That it's the oaths start articulating a duty to a social program or to society, right? And they're couched in terms of social justice, which, depending on how it's understood, maybe a good thing, maybe not a good thing, doesn't really matter. The physician's job is to treat the sick and to take care of the patient who presents to him or her for treatment. And qua physician, that's all that he or she needs to do, right? As a citizen, you can pursue other social programs, that you believe are worthy, but you should not use medicine to advance those aims. You shouldn't be, if you're trying to advance a particular political agenda, you shouldn't speak as a physician in any way that would suggest that you're speaking on behalf of the profession as a whole.
I think this is a terrible pollution in a sense. The example I've often used is, you go to the car mechanic and you have a tire or carburetor or whatever, and instead, he decides that your car should not be on the road. It's
right.
the wrong color. Maybe he doesn't believe in tires, or you should really be using a bicycle.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not actually that far fetched. I mean, Oxford, England, has a law out to do that. Basically, not to be the car mechanic, but to dictate when you drive, how many times you can leave your house, and so forth. And for anything that we have for liberty, there are always constraints. I mean, I can't drive infinitely. I have a car and I can drive when I want and so forth, but there are constraints. I need to sleep now and then. Certain, roads cost money, cars and, whatever. I need to keep it maintained. I need to keep it registered. So I don't have infinite capabilities, but I don't necessarily think that, aside from pricing mechanisms and a few statutes that I can't drive on the wrong side of the road, that the state should really be that much involved in it. But, people do what people do. And to a certain extent, I think the people in government, like governing, so it's kind of like you're running up against, people. There's an old expression, if you wrestle with a pig, you get dirty and the pig loves it. And I'm not calling governmental people pigs, but, they like governing. This is their strength. And we might like treating patients, and doing that in what I see with the obligation you mentioned to the patient, and trying to get that patient's car himself, that is his automotive self, back on the road in as fit as fashion as you can come up with. And it's not for you to judge, where he's going to be driving that. If he happens to be, I've literally over the years treated all kinds of criminals, and people that most likely would be recidivists as soon as I fix them. And it's not for me to say, oh my God, you are a criminal. Why would I fix your gallbladder? If I do that, you're just going to go back and criminalize.
Yeah.
My job is to fix the gallbladder, or
That's right.
Medicate this and that, and give him cholesterol pills so he can be a criminal as long as he possibly can. With cleaner arteries than he would be had I not given him that.
But that's the internal ethic of medicine. Those are the Hippocratic norms that say, my job is not to mete out criminal justice. That's the job of the court system. And I may think they're imperfect and that this guy should be punished more than he has been or more than he is. But as a physician, my job is always and only to help and heal him, and to give him the same excellent medical care that I would give to anyone else, in his shoes. I might not like this guy. I might not approve of what he's done with his life, but as a physician, I have to orient my art and my craft always toward the health and healing of the patient. So that's a perfect example of the framework that physicians need to be operating under, that we cannot instrumentalize medicine for other purposes, even if we think they're good purposes, meting out, punishment to a criminal. No, that's not the job of
It's
the
not your job.
physician.
I agree.
Establishing racial justice. Well, in your ordinary life, yes, try to do
Yeah.
that, but
Go
don't
vote
instrumentalize
for it.
medicine to try
I
to
agree. So I think
advance
that
another social program.
So I'm gonna let you have the last word. I'm gonna have one very last word after that. But I'd be happy and honored to have you back again. But
Yeah.
maybe you can summarize I don't know, what are the lessons learned, and what is your message for listeners?
So yeah, so I'm working on one other free speech case, which we didn't have time to talk about. But maybe next time I come on, I can tell folks about that. But I think the first thing that I would say is that censorship is incomplete medicine, which is why free speech of doctors and patients and people talking about public health policies is so important now. To foreclose on the possibility of debate will stall medical and scientific progress. And that's one of the problems with this law in California that we talked about. So scientists and physicians need to be always open to new data, always ready to articulate their reasons for doing things based upon evidence, and a kind of authoritarian, this is what I say, or this is what the state says, and therefore everyone has to go along with it, is ultimately going to be harmful to medicine as a whole and to patients. So my final word is we need to uphold that sort of classic doctrine of medical ethics articulated in Nuremberg of free and informed consent out of respect for patients. And that free and informed consent requires a climate in which doctors and patients can freely speak to one another, and dissenting opinions that go against a prevailing narrative can be voiced. And so those are both issues that I think for medicine and more generally for society as a whole are really important. And that's where I'm placing my focus these days in terms of my public policy work.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. Before you go, do you want to mention the book you have coming out?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, thank you. So I published a book this year called The New Abnormal. The subtitle is The Rise of the Biomedical Security State. And it's about not just what happened to us during COVID, but why. Where did this new model of managing a pandemic that involved things like lockdowns and vaccine mandates, where did it come from? And more importantly, the book is primarily looking toward the future. So there's a little bit of retrospective of the last 3 years, but it's also looking at, okay, where's this infrastructure that was rolled out during the pandemic going to go next? What are the next steps in this process? And what are the ways that I think freedoms are going to be harmed by what I call the biomedical security state? So the book's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, other online bookstores. You can download it on ebook like the Kindle. You can listen to it on audiobook. So
we'll put links up to it.
Great.
And comments and so forth. I'm going to give my own little tiny promotional. I have a book out. It's going to be published in Brazil in the next few weeks. It's overturning.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So the Portuguese version is published by a major publisher in Brazil within the next 2-3 months, I think, maybe sooner. So there'll be bookstores there. But it's overturning Zika. It's about the last great pandemic that kind of disappeared. No one ever heard about it. The subtitle is The Pandemic That Never Was.
Yeah.
And this book literally helps to do that, overturn Zika, because a lot of people are still working in fear from the last pandemic. We don't think about it as much here, but throughout the tropics, there's billions of people and hundreds of millions of young women, childbearing age, who think they have to stay inside for months at a time, whenever they might be pregnant, which is a good fraction of their young lives.
Yeah.
And slathering on insect repellent or keeping themselves covered, in hot weather, when in fact Zika microcephaly disappeared. It was only that one occurrence, and there's been no explanation. So that's my little chew toy that's been keeping me busy a lot during the last couple of years. Anyway, so thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. You can stay on for briefly, but I'm going to let you go. Let everyone else say goodbye to us. Thank you so much. And if you have questions, or would like to have questions for a second session, please let us know, and have a great day. Thanks. Bye-bye.